And then again, where Mount Hope is, it's hard to find parking if people aren't used to parking in that area.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, thank you for joining us. If your cell phone is on, could you please silence it, please? We want to give Megan our undivided attention. We are going to be on Facebook Live, so if you don't want your face on Facebook, just don't walk up here. Nobody is shown, just us and our slides up here. So thank you for coming and being so accommodating as we do this little lecture here. This is pretty cool. We've never really done a lecture in Sybil's home, and we just thought this was a really neat place, and Megan's getting her feet wet in the lecture tours, so she'll be on the road soon. Just a little information about Megan. She recently graduated with her bachelor's degree in history from Nazareth, and that was just this past spring. And now she's working on her master's degree in history with a concentration in American history through Indiana University. Megan's specialty has always been in American history, particularly in the Civil War. She chose the topic of women spies of the American Civil War to share with you today. And
we're going to talk about her today, and we're going to talk about a lot of other different women. The first thing I want to start with is this image here. And when we typically talk about the Civil War, images like this one here are usually what we think of. The idea of the brother versus brother, or the Brothers' War, and fighting it out on the battlefield. But with this narrative, so much of that history of the war is forgotten or left out. Women were not only spectators in this war, they had a ton of different other roles. There was this idea that they only managed the home front or cared for the sick or the wounded, but some of them actually fought as soldiers in the war, and then some of them also worked as spies. And there is this persisting narrative that portray women of the period as weeping widows, self-sacrificing wives, patriotic fiancées, and loyal daughters. However, that leaves out so much of the history of that war and that period. So before we really get started, there is a brief 2-minute video from the International Spy Museum that gives some context about some of these women.
Did you know that in the history of spies, women have been some of the most effective operatives? And in the U.S. Civil War, spies on both sides of the divide gathered vital intel for their cause. Beginning in 1861 and lasting for 5 long years, the Civil War in the United States was fought over states' rights and slavery, and pitted the United States.
Internet problems.
Of course.
I don't think so.
It's Sybil.
It's Sybil.
She heard Civil War. What are you talking about?
It's come
Now,
on.
I'm not even way, am I? Okay.
I guess we could skip the show, but it is very interesting. We are going to talk about pretty much all of the women that are in it anyways.
Government against breakaway Confederate states. While battles raged, behind the scenes, a secret war for intelligence also took place, and women played a vital role. At a time when gender discrimination meant that women were often expected to run the household, while their husbands, brothers, and sons went to fight, female secret agents could gather and pass on information without anyone noticing. In plain sight of the public, and often enemy eyes, they went about their covert business by doing things like hiding stolen goods in the folds of their hoop skirts, packing medicines into dolls' heads, and hiding messages in food. Who could not be enthralled by the stories of female spies like Belle Boyd, aka the Siren of Shenandoah, who socialized with Union soldiers to gather information for Confederate leaders like General Stonewall Jackson? Rose O'Neal Greenhow wrote secret ciphers, which were sewn into clothes, while Harriet Tubman, a Union spy and military commander, organized a team of black Union soldiers to scout behind Confederate lines. Elizabeth Van Lew led a Union spy ring in Richmond, Virginia, the main capital of the Confederacy. When the war ended, General Grant praised the information she provided through her coded dispatches. At a time when the punishment for spying could be death, these women put their lives on the line and had a significant impact on the war. Why do you think some women chose to work as spies during the Civil War?
So, during the war, hundreds of women worked as spies, either for the Confederacy or the Union. A lot of their stories are unfortunately left untold today, but we'll share some of them today. A lot of their stories are quite interesting. Personally, I didn't know a lot about any of them until I really started to research them. So before we get started on the actual spies, we're going to talk about some of the popular techniques that they used. One of the most popular was a coded message or a cipher. A cipher could work in a couple of different ways. Letters could represent other letters, or symbols or special characters and numbers could represent letters. There are two pictures of ciphers on this slide. The top one was a Confederate cipher disc, which used the method of letters standing for other letters. The bottom picture is of a Union cipher disc, which used symbols and special characters. Another really popular method that the spies used was invisible ink. And typically this could conceal messages on paper. Most of the time it was written in an organic fluid. Usually during the war it was lemon juice. And it would only become visible when it was heated with heat from like an iron or fire. Women spies also used disguises. A lot of times they would disguise themselves as men or unsuspected women. There's a spy that we're going to talk about today who would pose as an innocent country girl, just so no one suspected that she was spying. And they would also use hoop skirts, the steel metal bands in them. They would also use their corsets, their petticoats. Those were all popular hiding places. They would also use hollowed out eggs or vegetables, and they would stick messages inside them. Usually they were ciphered too. There's also an image of a shoe on this slide that is not of the time period, that is actually from the Cold War. But there was a woman that we're going to talk about named Pauline Cushman who actually would hide messages in the sole of her shoe too. So a lot of different methods and techniques during this time. And then I also want to talk about the Old Capitol Prison. Has anyone ever heard of the Old Capitol Prison before? So this is kind of essential for understanding a lot of these women spies, because a lot of them, the Confederate women spies, were sent here. And this was, during the Civil War, this was the Old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C., and it was used as a jail. But initially, the building was called the Old Brick Capitol, and it was used as a temporary home for Congress after the British burned the original Capitol building in 1814. At one point, the building was also used as a boarding house and a private school. But during the Civil War, the building was repurposed into a prison for imprisoning Confederate blockade runners, spies, and prisoners of war, as well as Union soldiers that were convicted of insubordination. And this was not a good prison by any means. The conditions were horrible. There was inadequate sanitation, poor ventilation, overcrowding, and vermin infestation. Some of the women, including Rose O'Neal Greenhow and Belle Boyd, were imprisoned here at various points during the war. And the building actually does not exist anymore. It was torn down in 1929. But the site of where it is actually where the U.S. Supreme Court building is today. So the first three women we're going to talk about are Belle Boyd and Rose O'Neal Greenhow and Pauline Cushman. I call them the big three because they're usually the most talked about. They have the most books written about them. Most people know about them if they've been studying them. a lot of their letters and stuff are really accessible. And they also, pretty much all of them, published their own memoirs. Belle Boyd published hers during, right after the war, called Belle Boyd in Camp in Prison. Pauline Cushman did not publish her own. One of her friends actually published it for her, but they used all of her letters. Pretty much anything she ever wrote down, they used it to write it for her. And then Rose O'Neal Greenhalgh published hers during the war in 1863. And I've read all of them. They're all very informative. They talk about all of their experiences during the war, how they acted as spies. Some of them even talked about their imprisonment and their run-ins with other soldiers, so they're all very interesting. So the first woman we're going to talk about is Pauline Cushman. And Pauline Cushman was a Union spy, and she is known as the Spy of the Cumberland. So she was born on June 10th, 1833 in New Orleans. Before the war, she actually worked as an actress in various parts of the country, in New Orleans, New York City, and Louisville. And while she was working in Louisville, that's when her career as a spy really began. She was staying in a boarding house that was operated by Confederate sympathizers. And at the time, she believed that friendship with the 2 paroled officers that were there would actually help her in helping the Union. But one afternoon, the officers actually approached her and bribed her to make a toast to the Confederacy. They bribed her with $300. And after confiding in a Union officer to make the toast, he had actually advised her to do it. He told her to do it, he thought it would be good for her, so she made the toast to Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. And that actually resulted in her being fired from the theater. But it began her career as a spy for the Federal Army, because she now had this cover story that she was a secessionist, that she was a Confederate sympathizer. They all thought that she was for them, so they would confide in her and tell them all their secrets. And she was able to gather information on the actions of Southern troops, passing the details on to Union generals. She disguised herself in various ways, even using men's clothing. She often used the cover story that she was actually searching for her brother who enlisted in the Confederate Army, and that actually allowed her to get behind Confederate lines quite a bit. She gathered information on the Confederates in northern Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and she relayed all of that intelligence back to Union officers. On one occasion, she also prevented the poisoning of Union soldiers at a boarding house while she was there posing as a Confederate sympathizer. The mistress of the boarding house revealed to Pauline that she was planning to sprinkle powder poison into the food and drink of Union soldiers. Pauline proceeded to alert those soldiers who left the boarding house and found another home elsewhere. During the summer of 1863, Pauline's biggest mission or task as a spy began while she was in Nashville, Tennessee. She was tasked with acquiring reports about the deployment, strength, and size of General Bragg's troops. The information that she secured actually assisted with the successful defeat of Confederate troops during the Tullahoma campaign and the Union pushing Confederate troops out from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And a little bit more about her. She was arrested in June of 1863 under suspicion of espionage, and she was transported to General Forrest's headquarters. At the time, she possessed plans and drawings of Confederate fortifications. And they discovered the documents hidden in the sole of her shoe. They did a full search. They searched her home even, where she was staying, and that's how they figured out that she was spying for the Union Army. She was then in prison and held for trial in Shelbyville, Tennessee. While she was there, a Confederate officer informed her that she was found guilty of espionage and they were going to hang her. But she fell ill with typhoid fever, and they told her they were going to wait until she recovered before they would. Yeah. But during that time, Union troops broke across enemy lines, forced the Confederates to retreat, and when they retreated, they left her behind. So the Union was able to save her. She returned back to Louisville, but she was in poor health for a very long time. And when she finally recovered, she was too famous to begin her career as a spy, or resume her career as a spy again. Too many people knew who she was. But President Lincoln endorsed her with the title of Little Major for her service and value to the Union, and he promised her a reward. But that reward was quickly forgotten, about a year later when he was assassinated. So she never got what was promised to her. In 1864, she performed the show The Spy of the Cumberland, which is where she got her nickname from, and it detailed her espionage experiences. After the war, she lived in poverty, and after she began to lose popularity. She did receive a small pension for the actions of her husband, but never for herself. And as time passed, her health was very fragile. She had a ton of different pains, and so she was prescribed opioids by her doctor. And she ended up overdosing on morphine on December 2nd, 1893, and she died. She was bound for internment in a potter's field because she was in poverty. But the Grand Army of the Republic quickly assumed all monetary duties, and they paid for her funeral, they paid for her internment, and today she is buried in the officers section of Presidio National Cemetery in San Francisco, California, all out of recognition for her services during the war. So does anyone have any questions about Pauline? So I do have a few pictures. Her uniform that she wears in a lot of her pictures is actually on display at the International Spy Museum. One of her letters was actually sold at an auction for $1,300. And then there is a picture of her grave in San Francisco. It does say Union Spy. The last name is different though because she did marry a couple of different times after the war. So her last husband, his last name is on the gravestone. So the next spy we're going to discuss is Belle Boyd, and she was a Confederate spy. And she was born on May 9th, 1844, to a wealthy and prominent family in Martinsburg, Virginia. Today, that area is now part of West Virginia, but when the war first broke out and when she was born, it was still part of Virginia. And she is known as one of the most notorious spies of the Confederacy. Her father participated in the Civil War by serving as a soldier for the Stonewall Brigade, and him and several other of her family members were actually convicted as spies during the war too. Her own spy work really did not begin until July of 1861 when a Union soldier invaded her home. In her memoir, she wrote that the soldier wanted to tear down a Confederate flag that she had hanging in her room. He wanted to raise the Federal flag or the Union flag on the property, and then she also wrote that he spoke really offensively to her mother. And she was so enraged with that she actually shot and killed that soldier. So Union soldiers were then stationed on the property because, near the property they were stationed around it, and they wanted to burn the home down after she killed one of their own. So they were going to plan to burn it down, but she wrote to the commanding officer telling them, don't let them burn my home down. And so he intervened. He stationed guards around the property to closely monitor her movements. And so after a review of evidence, she was found not guilty. They said that she was justified in her actions and she received no punishment. But the whole ordeal began her career as a spy for the Confederacy. She grew close to the guards that were stationed outside of her home, and she began to receive information from them. All of the intelligence that she acquired was then forwarded to Confederate authorities, and she disguised the messages by hiding them in hollowed-out fruit and doll heads, packing them into bread loaves, and sewing them into the soles of shoes. The words only appeared legible. She would also use invisible ink on eggs, and the words would only appear legible after they were held to a heat lamp. In May of 1861, she was residing with family relatives in their hotel in Front Royal, Virginia. And at the time, Union soldiers actually took over the hotel and they were holding meetings there, Council of War meetings. And she actually was able to eavesdrop through a door, and she acquired information about their plans. She wrote everything in cipher, and then she proceeded to then ride on horseback through enemy lines for 15 miles to deliver them information to General Stonewall Jackson. He himself even credited her intelligence with aiding in the success of the 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign, particularly with the Battle of Front Royal, where she was, and as the intelligence detailed outside and inside of Union lines. Despite being arrested 6 or 7 times, she was never imprisoned until July of 1862. And in July of 1862, she was imprisoned at the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. Throughout her imprisonment, she was not considered a model inmate by any means. She waved Confederate flags from her window. She organized a unique method of communicating with other Confederate sympathizers, and she would sing cheers for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. While she was there, she was still transferred intelligence because a contact would shoot a rubber ball into her room, and she would then use with a bow and arrow, and then she would sew messages back into that ball, and then she would throw it back to him. And she remained a prisoner until August, when Lafayette Baker became so sick of her trying to obtain a confession from her that he ordered her back to Confederate lines until the war's end. General Jackson instructed her to go visit relatives in Tennessee just so she wouldn't get captured again. But she was arrested again during the summer of 1863 after she crossed federal lines again. She was in prison for 3 months, and following her second release from prison, she was banished to the South. Eventually, she conceived of another way to help the Confederacy by working as a Confederate courier for dispatches in England. She attempted to leave for England in May of 1864, but was intercepted by Union troops. However, she fell in love with one of the Union officers, who later aided in her escape to London, and he deserted the Union Army. During her time in England, she composed and published her memoirs and began a stage career. She would lecture about her experiences, and then when the war was over, she returned back to America, continued acting, and provided lectures about her experiences throughout the country. At the age of 56, she died of a heart attack in 1900 while she was in Wisconsin giving one of her lectures. She also died in poverty, and at the time she had no permanent home and was living out of a hotel. She tried to make a living by presenting melodramatic plays about her experiences and her career as a spy for the Confederacy, but she found no success.
What happened to her husband?
Her husband, so the husband that left the army,
Yeah.
he actually went back to the States during the war while she was still in London, and they found out he was a spy and they executed him.
Oh.
So I do have some pictures. The one on the left, the brick building, is her home in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and I do believe it is actually a museum today. And then the one on the right is actually that hotel that her aunt and uncle worked for, owned, that she was able to eavesdrop on the conversations. That I think is also a museum today too. And then there's some signs all throughout the area talking about her and her time as a spy and how she helped Stonewall Jackson. There's a sign on US Route 340 just south of Front Royal, Virginia. So the next spy we're going to talk about is Rose O'Neal Greenhow, and she's the last of what I consider the big three, and she was a Confederate spy as well. So Rose O'Neal Greenhow was nicknamed Wild Rose, and she was born in 1814 in Port Tobacco, Maryland. She grew up in the company of Washington's influential political and social figures. Her family was very wealthy, and before the war, she further climbed the ranks of Washington's elite society as the wife of a wealthy and influential translator, librarian, and he was also the interpreter for the State Department for about 20 years. She often socialized with influential people, including Senator John C. Calhoun, James Buchanan, and the future president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. In the 1850s, she was met with several tragedies, as 5 of her 8 children and her husband each passed away. During the war, she went on to become a strong supporter of the Confederacy, and she led a large network of anti-Union spies. Her complete contempt for Abraham Lincoln, political connections, and sympathy for the South persuaded her to work as a spy for the Confederacy. Captain Thomas Jordan, he also approached her and told her he wanted her to create and manage Washington's spy ring in order to acquire information on Union military activities. He taught her how to use her curtains as a method of Morse code, He also provided her with a cipher of mysterious symbols. So she did not use a cipher disk. She had her own that was made just for her. Her and her messengers would carry messages that Rose had sewed into silk pockets that were concealed in hair or garments, and that were also stitched into tapestries. She even transmitted messages and signals across the Potomac River before the Confederates were actually pushed out of the region, and she wasn't able to do that anymore. But she would burn candles, and she would place a certain number in her windows to alert them of different things. Before the first major battle of the Civil War, she courted several men as a way of acquiring information. And that was actually where she got the nickname Wild Rose. They were suspicious of these men that were coming to her home and not leaving until 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning. So they called her Wild Rose. But she was able to gather information from politicians and diplomats. And then she proceeded to pass this information on to Confederate generals, including General Beauregard. And then in July of 1861, she obtained critical information about the Union's plans for the First Battle of Bull Run. She ended up sending Betty Duval, a 16-year-old girl, through enemy lines for 20 miles of Union territory to deliver a coded message to the Confederates. With her report and other intelligence received, the South won its first major victory of the war. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, credited her for the success at the battle, and in August of 1861, a raid was then conducted on her home. And she was arrested by Alan Pinkerton. So Pinkerton Detective Agency, that's when it really first started to begin, was during the war. And so he knew what she was doing, and so he was suspicious of what she was doing, and then they finally arrested her in 1861. Correspondence and numerous cipher letters were actually discovered torn up into her stove. She actually, when they first came to her home, she still had some of those letters in her pocket, and she made an excuse, and she went upstairs, and she actually swallowed all of them.
Oh.
Her and her youngest daughter were then placed under house arrest, though that did not stop Rose. She still continued to gather and transmit information, and she would use her daughter, who was called Little Rose, to transmit these messages on candy wrappers. Close friends were also permitted to still visit the home, so even though she was imprisoned, they still allowed her friends to come visit her. And they would actually carry out her messages in their boots or their stockings. Later, she was sent to the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. And the War Department charged Rose with aiding Confederate interests, espionage, and supplying Confederate generals with significant information regarding the movements of Union forces. While she was imprisoned, she still continued to transmit cryptic messages with Confederate leaders and generals. She was eventually released from prison in 1862. Union disposed of her case by sending her back to the South. She was then sent on a diplomatic mission by Jefferson Davis to go to Europe. And while she was in Europe, she published her memoir, and she worked unofficially as an ambassador for the Confederate government in Europe for 2 years. As time passed, she grew anxious to return home. She wanted to go back to the South. So, in 1864, she planned to return home. She got on a boat, and her ship actually encountered Union forces off of the coast of North Carolina. The weather was stormy, and her ship hit a sandbar. She tried to escape in a rowboat, but the boat capsized and she drowned in the choppy water. When she drowned, she was carrying $2,000 in gold bars strapped to her body and sewn into her dress. She wanted to bring that back home to the Confederacy. Her body washed ashore by Fort Fisher in the following days, and then she was buried with military honors in Wilmington, North Carolina. So does anyone have any questions about her? So I do have a few images of her. Oh, yes.
You mentioned like she used her curtains to give Morse code messages. Can you explain that?
I tried really hard to figure out how they did that, and I still have not figured it out, but all of the documents that are written about her actually say that that's what she did.
Would probably be long and
Yeah.
short, like dot,
yeah.
dot, dot, dot. Long, short,
Yes.
back and
Yeah.
forth, yeah, because it's all long and short things, and different arrangements, yeah. Dave, my husband's a radio nerd, so.
But I do have some pictures of her ciphers. This is what documents that she wrote in cipher. Her cipher code is actually that one right there on the left. And then there's also a letter that she wrote to Jefferson Davis. And then he wrote one back to her. And then there's also an illustration of the guards stationed outside of her home. Pretty much when they raided her home, they seized everything. And so a lot of it is actually in the National Archives today. And so you can actually access a lot of it online, or you can go there and ask for it too. And then there's also a little picture about her memoir, and then her grave in Wilmington, North Carolina. So the next spy I want to talk about is Elizabeth Van Lew. I would say she is just as well documented as the rest of the spies that I already talked about, but hers are not as accessible. She did not publish a memoir. She refused to publish one. I think it was because she didn't want to profit off of the war. But she did keep a diary, but the diary is only accessible by going to the New York City Public Library and asking to see it yourself. But she is just important as everyone else. And she was also nicknamed Crazy Bet, which I'll talk about towards the end. So, she was born in 1818, and she was considered a very valuable spy for the Union. She was from a very wealthy family that was greatly involved in Richmond society before the war. When she was growing up, Elizabeth was then sent to Philadelphia, where she attended a Quaker school. And that Quaker school is likely where the root of her anti-slavery politics and her support for the Union cause formed. She later returned to Richmond to be introduced into Richmond's elite society. But despite being active in the Richmond social scene, she never married. As the war broke out across the country, she aided Union soldiers in escaping from imprisonment by the Confederates. She would visit the infamous Libby prison in Richmond, bringing clothing and food to the prisoners. And Libby prison was actually an old tobacco building that was turned into a jail during the war. And the prison was known for its brutal guards and its harsh conditions. And with the assistance of a prison clerk, Erasmus Ross, who happened to be a Northern sympathizer, Elizabeth helped many of the prisoners escape. In order to ward off suspicions, she actually allowed a Confederate guard to stay with her, so nobody would suspect that she was helping the Union anyways. She opened her home to him. But in 1863, she was actually officially recruited by General Butler to be a spy for the Union. Two of the soldiers that she actually helped escape from the Libby prison had told him about what she had done, how important she had been to their escape, and he was so impressed, General Butler was so impressed, that he wanted her to be the head of his spy network and his main source of intel on the Confederacy and everything that was happening in Richmond. She would often use invisible ink that turned black when combined with milk. She wrote her notes in code, and she hid them in hollowed-out eggs or vegetables. On January 30th, 1864, she informed General Butler that the Confederacy planned to ship prisoners who were imprisoned in the overcrowded Libby prison. They actually wanted to transport them to Georgia's Andersonville prison. Her note implied the necessary amount of forces needed to attack and help with freeing those prisoners, and it was immediately sent to Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War during the war, who then ordered a raid. Unfortunately, a Union soldier had warned the Confederate Army of what they wanted to do, which allowed the Confederates to rebuff the attack, so it was not successful. Throughout the war, though, she did amass a spy network of approximately 12 people to help with collecting information about the Confederacy to bring to Union troops. One of the most significant people in her spy group was Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who we'll talk about next, and her reports often made it to General Grant's breakfast table for him to read. They were so important, he would read them while he was eating breakfast. And for her Union sympathies, Elizabeth was ostracized by Richmond society. Unlike some of the other women, though, though she did receive a small stipend for all of her work during the war. And when the war was over, she actually became the postmaster of Richmond. She was appointed by President Grant in 1869. And during this time, this was considered one of the most prestigious and lucrative jobs that a woman could hold. She held the job for 8 years, and at that time, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president, and he didn't want her to have that job. So she lost her job, and she did continue to keep working in the postmaster's office as a clerk between 1883 and 1887, but she then chose to quit after she was demoted, and she received less pay than her male counterparts. She then started to promote progressive ideas, including women's suffrage and civil rights. She would lecture about those. However, her final days were spent living in poverty. All of her family's fortune was spent on being a spy during the war, and so she had nothing left. There was a Union soldier's family who did have to decide to help her. They actually aided her for the rest of her life until she died, because they were so happy about what she did, how they helped their son escape from prison, that they paid for everything, her home. But the high-class society that she frequently was associated with before the war, they labeled her as a traitor. They didn't trust her anymore, and she actually got the nickname Crazy Bet, because she would walk around Richmond muttering to herself and singing nonsense songs too. But that was all part of her disguise, but after the war that still stuck. So they nicknamed her Crazy Bet, and so nobody really wanted to associate with her. She was labeled as crazy and eccentric, but she leaves the legacy of being an essential asset to the Union and an effective spy. So any questions about Elizabeth? Yes?
Where did that image come from that says the spy?
I think there's actually an image from a book.
Mm-hmm.
She never wrote her own book, but a lot of people have actually written books about her, and I think that's the title of one.
That would be, okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of pictures of her that I was able to find, too. They're all from, like, the side profile, though.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Jennifer Shiverini wrote an historical novel.
Okay.
By her.
Yeah, I've
And
seen
it's
a
very
few
good.
of them.
I mean, it's very historically documented.
And then there's also a picture of her family mansion in Richmond. It's not there anymore. I believe it burnt down. And then there's also an image of her seized correspondence. She also had her own cipher code, so that one's hers on the left. And then there's another sketch of her home in Richmond, too. And her burial site in Richmond, and then she also has a memorial. So the next spy we're going to talk about is Mary Elizabeth Bowser, and her and Elizabeth family worked very closely together. So Mary Elizabeth Bowser, also known as Mary Jane Richards, was born sometime around 1840. We do not know the exact date when she was born, but historians have narrowed it down to about that time. And when she was born, Mary was actually enslaved by the Van Loo family in Richmond before Elizabeth Van Loo, who was against slavery, helped free her after her father, Elizabeth's father, John Van Loo, had passed away. Elizabeth's father had passed away in 1843, so after that time she was free. And she worked as a spy for Elizabeth throughout the war. It is also claimed that she worked for Jefferson and Varina Davis in the Confederate White House. And during this time, she would copy documents that were sitting on Jefferson's desk, and she would send them to Union forces. There's a lot of speculation about whether or not that is true. It's been very difficult to find actual primary source material about it, but most things that you read will say that that's what she did. And she did, I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but she did give a speech about what she did too. And between 1861 and 1863, she assisted with securing food and medicine for Union soldiers who were in prison at Libby Prison. So she was helping Elizabeth free those soldiers. And in 1864 and in 1865, it is known that she gathered military and political intelligence for the Union. After the war, she gave an address in Brooklyn in the fall of 1865, where she discussed her infiltration of the Confederate White House. This story, which has been difficult to find documentation of, reveals her willingness to risk her life as a spy. And reportedly, while working in the Confederate White House, she did keep a diary. However, one of her descendants in the 1940s and 1950s, not knowing what they had, threw it out. In the following years, when Mary was still alive, she became a teacher for the Freedmen's Bureau before setting up a school in St. Mary's, Georgia. The last known account of her life is actually from 1870, when she wrote a letter to Elizabeth Van Lew, and it indicated that Elizabeth had been sending her money. During this time, Mary was actually working as a teacher and a seamstress in New York City. Unfortunately, after that period, nobody knows anything about her life after that point. We do not know when she died, how she died, or how she spent her later years. Information is actually still being discovered and recovered today. But on June 30th, 1995, she was inducted into the U.S. Army Intelligence Hall of Fame in Arizona in recognition of all of her contributions during the war. Unfortunately, though, because nobody knows when she died, she has an empty tomb. So does anyone have any questions about Mary? So the next person we're going to talk about is Nancy Hart Douglas. She was a Confederate spy in North Carolina, but then she moved to Virginia, and then I believe West Virginia. She was born in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1846. Her mother was actually first cousins with Andrew Johnson, who became the president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. As an infant, Nancy moved in with her family in Virginia, and then in 1853, she actually moved in with her sister and brother-in-law in what is now called West Virginia. At the time, it was still part of Virginia. She became an excellent shot with a rifle and horseback rider during her time there because it was a very secluded area, and she basically lived in the wilderness for the next 6 years. The region became a dangerous place when the war broke out because the citizenry of the area held divided beliefs. Half of them supported the Union cause, the other half supported the Confederate cause. And this separated many friends, families, and neighbors. Her hatred for the Union cause, though, was actually fueled by events in 1861. William Clay Price, her brother-in-law, was actually taken in by Union soldiers for questioning, but days later he still had not returned home. So they went out searching for him, and his body was found nearby with a gunshot in the back. So Nancy, because she was so upset about what happened, she soon joined a pro-Southern guerrilla group called the Moccasin Rangers. And between 1861 and 1862, she rode throughout Western Virginia at the head of the group alongside the leader. She would travel by herself at night and sleep during the day in order to transport messages to the Southern armies. And she was also able to save several lives of Confederate soldiers by hiding them with Confederate sympathizers. She would also disguise herself as a farm girl who would peddle eggs and vegetables to the Union in order to acquire information. She reported on the strength, the population, and the vulnerability of federal outposts located in the Virginia mountains to General Stonewall Jackson. She actually led numerous raids on Union troops herself, too. She soon married Joshua Douglas, settling in the mountains near Confederate lines. She would carry information to Confederate lines by disguising herself as an innocent country girl. So they didn't really suspect that she was doing anything. But in 1862, the tide really turned when the Union promised a reward for her capture. Eventually, she was taken into custody and imprisoned in West Virginia in the upstairs of a rundown home. A guard was stationed with her at all times, while Union soldiers were quartered downstairs. However, Nancy stole the gun off of her guard, fatally shot him, and escaped back to Confederate lines. To escape, she jumped out of a 2-story window, the window where she was imprisoned. She stole a horse, got on the horse, and then rode back to Confederate lines. About a week later, she returned back to where she was imprisoned, This time, she had over 200 Confederate cavalrymen with her. Union soldiers and officers stationed in the region were sleeping during the time, becoming easy prey for her. And so Nancy and her group proceeded to destroy wagons, burn homes, steal horses and mules, and take their own prisoners. And then until the end of the war, she continued to assist the war effort in any way that she could, but she did know what would wait for her if she were captured again. So she tried to keep her distance, but she still wanted to help. After the war, she lived out the rest of her lives in the mountains until she died in 1913, and she is buried in West Virginia today. And there's a memorial to her. It was actually presented by the 4th grade class yet. The next person we're going to talk about is Harriet Tubman. And she was a Union spy. Harriet Tubman was born around March 1822, and most people remember her for her work as an Underground Railroad conductor. During the pre-war years, Harriet escaped slavery and risked her life on several occasions as she aided with helping other enslaved people escape to the North and to Canada. Throughout the Civil War, she worked as a Union spy master too. She was responsible for setting up a large espionage ring for the Union during the war. She was actually recruited by the Union to form a spy network of former enslaved people in South Carolina. And she was actually provided with access to Secret Service funds, and she also had a military pass. In early 1862, she traveled to South Carolina and recruited African American men to pose as servants or enslaved people in order to slip behind Confederate lines and gather intelligence. She was tasked with identifying and mapping Confederate outposts and vulnerabilities. Harriet and her scouts also gathered information to help Union forces with destroying the goods and property of plantation owners and liberating enslaved African Americans. In June of 1863, Harriet joined a newly formed South Carolina regiment composed of the formerly enslaved. The regiment conducted a successful raid which resulted in over 750 African Americans being freed from slavery. Many would go up north and join the Union Army. For Harriet's service, she received $200 over the course of 3 years for her involvement in the war. However, because so much of that was being paid for her work as a spy, that was not enough for her really to live on. So to earn a living, she actually sold pies, gingerbread, and root beer. Following the war, she was also denied from receiving a pension for her work, despite a General Saxon recommending that she did receive one, but she never got one. She did receive an $8 a month widow's pension for her husband's passing, which she began to receive in June of 1890. Finally, in 1899, she received an increase to that widow's pension, and it was authorized at $25 a month. However, she only ended up receiving $20 a month. In 1908, she opened the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, which she had been saving money for over the years. After her death, she received military honors at her funeral in 1913, and she was buried in Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. In 1892, the Smithsonian Institution acknowledged that she was the only American woman to both plan and lead a raid. In 2003, students at the Albany Free School raised the issue of the remaining pension that was missing from her to attention. Congress then responded by authorizing a payment of $11,750 to the Harriet Tubman Home in Auburn. We do have statue of her, dedications for her in Auburn, and then we also have some photos of the Harriet Tubman National Historic Park in Auburn too. Does anybody have any questions about her?
Is there a new museum there too?
Yes, I believe there is. Yep.
Yeah, I haven't found it.
And the last person we're going to talk about is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. She is more of a suspected Union spy. It was never actually proven that she was, but some people say that she was. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, she was born in 1832 in Oswego, New York. She was raised by abolitionists and freethinker parents, which helped nurture her independence. Her father was regarded as a country doctor, leading to her growing an interest in medicine. Her mother also believed that corsets and long skirts were unhealthy, so Mary and her sister were known for wearing bloomer pants and shirts. Mary's parents also opened the first free school in Oswego so that Mary and her sister could attain the same level of education as her brother could. As she grew older, Mary taught school for some time before saving enough money to attend medical school. And in 1855, Mary finally graduated from Syracuse Medical College with her degree in medicine. She graduated with honors and was the only woman in her class. And she was just the second woman to graduate from here after Elizabeth Blackwell. She was just, following her graduation though, she did marry Albert Miller, another medical student, and they did open a practice together until 1859 when Mary decided to sue for divorce. And she did get her divorce after 10 years.
Wow.
As the war broke out across the country, Mary wanted to be a surgeon for the army, but the opportunity was denied because she was a woman. She then served at the U.S. Patent Office Hospital in Washington as an unpaid volunteer. In 1863, Mary is finally given commission into the Union Army. She became the first female U.S. Army surgeon. Congress also gave her permission to wear what is now considered male clothing for the field. Throughout the war, she crossed enemy lines countless times to treat the wounded soldiers and civilians. And in 1864, though, Confederate troops captured and imprisoned her for being a spy. Many claim that she acted as a spy throughout the war, but there is not much proof of whether that is true. For the next 4 months, she was imprisoned near Richmond. She would spend the rest of her life living with health problems from her experiences at that prison. And eventually she was released as part of a prisoner exchange. They exchanged her with other medical doctors. And after her release, she worked as a supervisor for a female prison in Kentucky, and she was also the head of an orphanage in Tennessee. When the war was over, she did not receive a pension because the Army did not officially commission her. She did receive a small disability pension, likely for the health problems that were inflicted while she was imprisoned. In June of 1865, President Andrew Johnson then awarded Mary with the Medal of Honor. She then continued to lecture throughout the United States and Europe on hygiene, women's rights, and dress reform. She was arrested in 1870 for dressing as a man, but she responded to the criticism by saying, "I don't wear men's clothes, I wear my own clothes." She did try to vote in 1871, but she was refused. And so she would then continue to lecture and write in support of women's suffrage. In 1895, she purchased 135 acres near Rochester. In between, she opened her home to people who had been ostracized, arrested, or harassed, just like she had been. In between 1916 and 1917, Congress then decided to remove over 900 names from the Medal of Honor listing, and Mary's was one of them. And I believe it was because they claimed that she actually did not fight in the war as a soldier, so that's why they took it away. But she kept it for the rest of her life and refused to give it back. Soon afterwards, though, she fell on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. She was hospitalized and she remained in a weakened state of health for some time. She passed away in 1919, and she was buried in a black suit in Oswego Cemetery. In 1997, the Medal of Honor was restored to Dr. Mary Edwards Walker by President Jimmy Carter. Today, she remains the first and only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor. In honor of her contributions and work, Oswego unveiled a statue in her honor in 2012. Then, this year, she was actually recognized on a special quarter by the U.S. Mint. And so there's her, and then her Medal of Honor is also on it. And she is the 13th woman to ever be recognized in the American Women Quarter Series. And we actually have one of those quarters for all of you all today.
Aww.
directly from the U.S. Mint, so they've never been circulated or anything like that. Then we have some pictures of her statue in Oswego, and then her medals too on the right. And then some concluding notes. Many women spies were prevented from getting the deserved recognition for the intelligence work that they did during the war because of stereotypes and gender barriers. So most of these women are not often discussed, despite all the work they have done and their contributions to the war effort. These women each served as spies for the same reasons as men, to protect their homes, their families, and their country, or out of moral conviction. So I want to close this lecture with an 1866 quote from the historian Frank Moore, who said, "The story of the war will never be fully or fairly written if the achievements of women in it are untold." Does anyone have any remaining questions? Yes,
Where is the Spy Museum?
it's in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I've been there once, and it's a very interesting museum.
Washington, yes, International School.
Alright, well, thank you guys for all coming.
Great.
Thank you.
And everyone does get a quarter.
If I can squeeze through here, I can help.
Megan, this isn't your first presentation.
Yes, it is.
This is your first one?
Yes, it is.
Oh, wow.
Thank
You're
you.
good.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is really nice. Wow. Very nice. I never would have guessed that this was your first presentation. You're so comfortable. Yeah, comfortable.
Oh, thank you.
Stories though.
We will probably do a part 2 because we actually had to cut out a lot of spies that we planned to talk about because it was way too long. So there's actually a lot of other women we want to talk about, so we'll probably do a part 2.
Great.
The only one I was really familiar with is the one from Auburn.
Oh, yes.
The only one I was familiar with. That's my area. I've been to her
Yeah.
place. Wow. So much I don't know.
Always let me discover too.
Thank you. Pretty cool quarters, huh? Wow.
Cool.
We tried to get them from the bank,
Yeah.
but they wanted us to dig through a box to see if they actually had. Are you kidding?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
So then we went to the U.S.
So we went to the source.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah.
Did you tell them what you were doing?
Oh, we did. Yeah. Good.
Tracy, I don't know if you heard me say, I can't believe this is her first lecture.
I know, and she wanted to do it. We didn't have to beg or anything.
The more you do, the more you'll get so good.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a specialty in your master's degree that you're working on?
American history and the Civil War.
In the Civil War?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Civil War.
Yep. I actually did write, when I was still at Nazareth, I wrote a senior capstone paper on women spies of the Civil War, so that's why I got the inspiration to do this.
And her professor wants her to publish it.
Yes.
Just FYI.
That's terrific.
So, yeah, and I think she should.
Awesome.
If you guys are interested, we do have some refreshments in the dining room, of course. Just help yourselves, and we have coffee and water and some delicious cookies, not made from Civil War recipes. We thought about it, but we didn't think anybody would want hardtack, so. But please help yourselves.
Very good.
Very nice. You made it so interesting.
Thank you.
Well, you know, I've said over the years when I've sat through lectures on history, if they were my teachers in high school, I would have enjoyed
Been more
history
interested,
better.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just don't trip. Oh, lift your toes, Bonnie, just a second. Okay, you're gonna, that's good.
It's just like they say, the only we get smarter our parents become, right? That's amazing. But it's funny because when they first started this order thing, I decided I was gonna collect a full set of that first one. They're still not. I can't throw it away because I made this box myself.
Sea legs after
Yeah, I hear ya.
No, you're too young. You're too young.
Oh, no, I'm